For autumn this year, I figured it would be fun to paint something for Halloween. So in this tutorial, I decided to paint a skull so that we could do two things. The first is to work through some of the anatomy of the skull, which of course is a structure underneath every portrait. And the second is just to do something fun, paint something cool for Halloween. I even set up some fake candles to make it look like a Halloween video. So there we go. Alright, let's start this one. Up on the screen now is a high resolution photo of my completed painting, so if you're going to be painting along with me, you could use this as your reference. And like always, the gridded version and the reference photo that I used to paint this one will be up on the members page, so if you want to help support the channel, consider becoming a member. I have a high-res photo of my completed painting on the left side of the screen here, and I'll be working on my painting on the right, that way you can see what I'm working towards. Just like portrait painting, I always like to start with the eyes, so I'm going to do the same thing on this skull painting. My completed painting is 24 inches by 24 inches, so it's 2 feet by 2 feet, and I'm working on a smooth gessoed canvas that I prepared myself. I have a few videos showing how I set those up. This entire painting is going to be done in one color. It's going to be black and white, kind of like a grisaille, and the color that I'm using for this is a mixture of 50% black and 50% sepia, and that's made by Createx Illustration Colors. These are transparent paints and they're erasable, so we're going to be scratching into the paint to remove out all the highlights. I find that the color black is pretty difficult to erase into, so that's why I mixed it with some sepia, just to make it a little bit easier to erase. If you look at my completed painting, you'll notice that the light source is very dramatic, and both of these eyes are in very dark shadow, so they're basically pure black. And the eyes or the eye sockets are called the orbits. I'm using a shield to line up with the contours of the left orbit, and then I'm spraying a good amount of this paint in here. The more I spray, the darker it'll be. And a few layers sprayed at 100% will look pretty much pure black. The background of this painting is also going to be pure black. It's going to be a solid color. I'm using a shield here to line up with the left side of the skull on that transition point between the orbit and the background. That way I can spray in a very sharp line to define the edge of the skull from that black background. Then I'll spray a gradient within this orbit, more paint on the right side of it, making that side darker, and less as I move over to the left. And a gradient just means a transition from a dark value to a light value, which we have here in this left eye. There's a small highlight here in between the orbit and the black background. This is part of the zygomatic bone. You really can't see it on the left side of the face here because this is a 3/4 profile and the nasal bone is blocking it, but the zygomatic bone is right here on the right side of the face. You can see it a lot clearer just to the right of the eye. So in order to get this highlight in between the background and the orbit, I'm using an eraser here, scratching into that paint. When I'm doing this, all that's happening is it's removing some of the paint, showing that white gessoed canvas underneath, making it lighter. I can also use this eraser to lightly erase into the left side of the orbit to add to that gradient, make it a little bit brighter on the left side here. Besides those stick erasers, another tool that I'll be using a lot here is an electric eraser. Any brand will do. The one I'm using here is going to be linked down below. The way that I really like to use these is to run it along a sandpaper sharpener. These small sandpaper blocks that are used for sharpening pencils are pretty inexpensive, so it's always good to have a few. But if you don't have these, 60 to 100 grit, anywhere in that range will work just fine. And then what I do is I just run the electric sharpener right over the edge of it at a sharp angle. And you can see when I'm done with it, I just get a pretty sharp point at the end. And then with that sharp point, I can direct it exactly where I want. I'll just go over this edge another time and just tap in a few small dots. Electric erasers are pretty aggressive, so I'm just trying not to press it too hard on the canvas. I'm just kind of floating it over the edge, lightly touching it to the surface to remove some paint. As I start moving along over to the right eye, look at my completed painting and pay attention to where you see darks and where you see light values. You'll notice that the majority of this area in here that I'm circling is pretty much all in shadow. It's a very dark area. So even though that needs to be dark, I don't want to get to it right away. I want to slowly work my way up to that dark value. And while I'm building up the paint, I also want to make sure I add plenty of texture into it. So the tool that I'm using right now is one of these skin texture templates that I use on all my portraits. This is just a sheet of Mylar that has some holes burnt into it. And you can see I just line it up on the canvas and then spray over it. Those dots and textures are transferred over to the canvas, and now when I glaze some more paint over the top of them, it'll just start to blend everything smooth, but some of that texture is still going to stay there. If you look at this close-up shot of my completed painting, you can clearly see all this texture I'm getting, and that texture template is one part of this. And the other major way that I'm able to build up this texture is a lot of erasing into the paint and glazing more paint over the top. Basically just building up layer after layer. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm using the two erasers, the stick eraser and the electric eraser, laying down some paint and then erasing into it. The top edge of this nose that's covering some of the left eye is called the nasal bone. And you can see that the edge of the nasal bone just protrudes outside the left side of the painting. So the way that I'm going to start painting this area in is not by painting the skull itself, but by painting in the background. So you can see with my shield there, I just lined it up above the edge of the nasal bone and sprayed in the back. A lot of this paint almost looks pure black. This way we just set that transition point between the background and the skull. On that transition point, I'm going to erase out a very thin highlight. This way it'll make it look like the edge of the nasal bone is just catching a little bit of light and kind of protruding. If you're just getting into painting and want to try to understand how to paint this realistic look, one tip that I can give you, which is very important, is to avoid dark outlines around your painting. So you can see what I did here was instead of adding an outline to the outside of the nose, I erased out a highlight. Painting in a realistic style is just an illusion. It's just a bunch of tricks that make it look realistic. And the small highlights that you see along the outside of the painting make it look like some part of it is sticking out, giving the illusion of depth. And that effect makes a two-dimensional surface like my painting give the illusion of a 3D space. I'll further add to that effect by using my electric eraser like I'm doing here, just erasing along the edge of the eye. As I start to paint in this right eye or this right orbit with a shield and the same color, let me just explain a little bit more about what I'm talking about. On the left side of the screen, I'm placing up my painting and a cartoon illustration. If you take a look at the illustration on the top, you'll notice that there's a dark outline around the entire image. There's also dark outlines around the features like the teeth, the nasal bone, and the orbits. And dark outlines like this are one of the most common ways to make an image look flat. Nothing in life or in nature has a dark outline around it, so we don't see this as realistic. Instead, we see it as a stylized image like a cartoon or an illustration. And then if you look at my painting below it, which is the same thing, it's still a painting, it has a very different effect. And one thing that you'll notice is that there's no dark outlines around any part of my painting. It's just transitions from one value to another value. And the amazing thing about art is that you as the painter get to decide what type of style you want to add to your paintings. Because you and only you are 100% in control of your own work. And that's one of the reasons why painting is just so interesting and so personal, because everyone is going to have a different subjective opinion. And neither the top image, my painting on the bottom, or your painting is any better than the other. They're just different paintings of the same thing done in different styles. It's all personal preference. So in order for me to paint this outline or the contour on the edge of the skull, I'm not going to come around and paint a dark line. What I'm doing instead is lining up my shield and spraying in the background behind it. So the way that I think about it is instead of an outline, I just think of it as a transition point, a transition between that really dark, basically pure black background, and then the lighter value of the skull, which is in a highlight here. And that transition of values adds to the realistic effect that we're going for in this style of painting. So I'll just use some more of this paint to fill in this background to get a solid color of black. And what we're going to do now is start painting in some of the texture across the skull. And just as a reminder, this entire painting is done in the single color that I showed in the beginning of the video. This large area of bone just above the eyes is called the frontal bone, and this is where the forehead is. All I did up here was spray down some paint a bit darker on the right and a thin glaze over to the left. That way I have something there that I can erase into. The tool that I'm going to be using to get in a lot of this texture is a sand eraser made by Tombow. This eraser has a lot of grit to it and is extremely aggressive. So what I do is I use an X-Acto blade to cut out a chisel in the end of it. This way it has a sharper and more acute point so I can focus it exactly where I want to erase out paint. And links for this eraser will be down below. So what I'm going to be doing with this eraser is basically going over most of my painting. Once I lay down paint, I'll go over it with this, erase out in a few different motions just to remove some of it. And while I'm erasing with this, I'm trying to make sure that it's not too controlled. I don't want it to be too clean. I'm almost using this to get a messy texture because I feel that a more random texture like this just helps add to the effect of the skull. As I'm doing this, I'm also looking at the reference that I'm painting from. I'm squinting my eyes and paying attention to where I see large masses of light and dark. Anywhere that I notice an area needs to be brighter or lighter,
I use this eraser with a good amount of pressure in it just to scratch out as much paint as I can. Even though this eraser is extremely aggressive, it's not going to remove 100% of the paint. It's always going to leave down some texture, and that's what we want. There's a small amount of texture here on the brow ridge, so I'm just painting it in freehand. You can see that I'm just painting in a few small dots, using this to add some very subtle texture. As I mentioned before, the other way that I'm going to be adding some of these dot textures is using the texture template that I made myself. You could see here all the small holes in it, so when I spray paint over that, that's just going to get transferred over to the canvas. And I'll use that right here on the left side in that area that we erased out before. Just very lightly spraying over it, adding in some small dots into that area. And you can see the effect we get. It's just a subtle texture. If I need a texture that's more controlled, I'll just do it freehand like I'm doing here. Now, as I move over to the right and continue painting, I'm going to be using all of these techniques in combination. Here's a close-up shot of what the final texture looks like on the frontal bone. And you can see that we just add them all up and just continually build them. And you get something that looks very gritty, very grainy. And I think this works very well for this type of painting. So all I'm doing here is just that combination of adding a thin glaze of paint, either with a shield or a ripped piece of paper, adding some dot textures with my texture template or freehand, and then erasing into it with a stick eraser, that Tombow sand eraser, or an electric one. If you combine all these techniques, you could build up some really interesting, some really crazy textures, and I think it's fun. It definitely adds the effect that I'm going for in this one, that really grungy, gritty look. As I move along to the right side, the one thing I want to pay attention to here is the zygomatic bone. This area right here, this curve is called the zygomatic arch, and you can see that it's in a lot of shadow. So we have a bright highlight over to the left where the zygomatic bone is, and then a dark shadow over to the right. So you can see here for that highlight, I'm mainly using my electric eraser just to erase out a bunch of small little dots next to each other to give one mass of highlight. And that way it just makes it look like that part of the zygomatic is catching some light and reflecting it. So when you're building up these textures, try giving these techniques a shot. But remember to always focus on those major macro values of light and dark, because that's going to define the entire shape of the skull. Texture is obviously very important, but it's always going to be secondary to those large values of light and dark. And this is important. Make sure you experiment with different techniques, not just the things that I'm saying in this video. So to finish up part 1, let me just show you an example of what I'm talking about. I was experimenting with some different textures up here on the frontal bone. I was working in this area with the skin texture template and some different erasers like this electric eraser. Before I started one of my painting sessions, I was just patching a few holes in the wall that I mount all my paintings to. And sitting right next to me was some of the drywall joint tape that I was using. So I decided to experiment with it, just spray over the top of it to see what type of texture I get, because it might work very well for the skull. So I made a few passes with it in some different areas, not spraying too much paint because I don't want this too dark. And just like that, I got a new and very unique texture to add with all the rest. And was this texture the perfect tool to use in this part of the painting? Probably not, but that's not the point. The point is that the more you paint, the more you learn and build up new techniques to use in the future. So even though this texture probably didn't fit in so great with the skull, I bet it's useful for something else in the future. Maybe if I'm painting some fabric or some clothes, who really knows? But I'll definitely keep a piece of this joint tape next to me in case I need it in a future painting. So that's where I'm going to finish the first part of this video. In the next one, we'll be painting the left side along the nasal bone down to the lower part of the skull. I hope you enjoyed this video, and more importantly, I hope you learned a thing or two. I want to say thank you so much to the generous support of these channel members. Your support truly helps keep this channel going, so thank you. And I'll see you back here next Friday.